nothing. Do I need to push something? I'll let them work on it. If I get a hand signal that I can move away from this, I'll probably do that. But it's a good day. It is a great opportunity every time we have a chance to fellowship with God's people. Amen? It's a good thing. And yes, I've been told, and I remember, and I'm well aware that it's the 3:30 hour and you're still tired. I get that. But I have some good news. There's food on the other end of this, so we can rejoice in that. There's always something to look forward to. I think the last time that I stood on this stage and gave a lesson was as a student here. And my wife and I had no idea where all that would take us in the years that followed. All right. Tell you what, I'll probably just stay here then. Thank you for that. I had no idea at the time where that might take us, and we've been blessed to work in different regions of the country, to go back near our home in Michigan, and to be up in New England, actually for the first time in my life, to work with a congregation in Connecticut, and now back here, where we were definitely grateful to be back into this region. And one thing that we've learned is that people are different. Cultures are different. And you know what? That's okay. Because within the church, we have something that is more powerful, that can go beyond all of those differences and unite us. And I'm so grateful for the overall topic that we're looking at in unity in 1 Corinthians, and to just think through some of those lessons, because God has given to us a blueprint to bring us together in such a way that the world is looking for, that other people want, but we have it right in front of us. And so at the end of this lesson, we're going to tie this chapter from this section from 1 Corinthians 15 back to that concept of unity, because I think it's a powerful lesson. And if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to 1 Corinthians 15 right now, and we're going to spend most of our time in that particular section. And we're going to look at the topic, really the question raised by Paul, which is, how are the dead raised? And I want us to think through really this very idea for just a moment, to get a little bit of context. Yesterday at this same time slot, we looked at the first part of this chapter, and this chapter was all about the fact that Christ was raised. And that's the foundation for everything that we're going to look at with this lesson. The fact that Jesus is raised. And so Paul wants the Corinthians to understand, because he was raised, you will be as well. And everything that we're going to look at follows from that idea. And when we think about the resurrection of Christ, we get to think about it every single Sunday when we partake of the Lord's Supper. And maybe you spent a little extra time in the last few weeks with our holiday of Easter that we celebrate, and we may think a little bit more about the resurrection of Christ. And when we think about what that did for the disciples in the New Testament, it gave them clarity. We see them struggling before that. We see them floundering in the midst of what was happening to Jesus with his death as they marched into Jerusalem. We all know that triumphal entry, no doubt with visions of what might happen, and yet it seems like it's ripped completely apart. And yet all of it was exactly as God intended. And once they saw that picture, that reality of his resurrection, it completed the puzzle for them. It gave them clarity. And we see that same group that when the shepherd was struck, they fled, taking the gospel to the entire world and preaching a message based on the resurrection of Christ that was powerful enough to change the entire world. That's the foundation by which we find ourselves within our text. And as I was looking at some of the other authors writing on this subject in preparation for this lesson, I saw one individual who asked a great question, because we speak so confident of the resurrection itself. And he said, are we certain of it? And the second part was this: if we are so confident in the resurrection, then why does it appear at times that we live as if it's not a reality? And that's a good question for us to examine, to think about within our own lives, but also go beyond ourselves. If we are so confident in the resurrection, that there will be a resurrection, because we are so confident that Christ was raised from the dead, then what about our loved ones? Then we should be just as confident that they will be raised as well. And we know what that means if we find ourselves outside of Christ. And so I think it's good to think about, if we are so confident about it, then why do we sometimes live as if it may not happen? One of the ministries that I was blessed to be a part of in Connecticut was a grief ministry. And overall, it was, in my experience, one of the most successful ministries that I've ever been a part of. And we were able to work with people from the congregation. We were able to work with many people from outside of the congregation, many of whom had some sort of Christian background, but also some who had very little Christian background as well. But we all found ourselves in the same category of grief. And within this grief ministry, I got to constantly hear people pour out their hearts and also ask questions, very relevant questions, one of which you probably know and maybe have asked yourself: why? Why did I lose my loved one? Why am I in a position where it seems like I cannot function without my spouse? Or even this one: why did I lose my child? And in the midst of processing that grief and thinking through some of those questions, we can't help but speculate as well on what is next. What does that look like? What happens now? And of course, in this ministry, lots of people pondered those questions. And you're probably aware as well that all around us, there are lots of different ideas about what that looks like. And there are lots of different concepts about what that may be like. Some of them have some sense of biblical reality, and others probably not so much. But yet our minds still wonder, what will that be like? I found an interesting quote. Nothing's working for me today. All right, maybe they can change it in the back. I thought he said just hit the button, but doesn't seem to be doing anything. All right, maybe you can read that. I will read it otherwise, and it is attributed to C.S. Lewis. And he says, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. I say attributed to C.S. Lewis because I've seen a lot of things attributed secondhand to C.S. Lewis that I'm not quite sure that they might be. You know how things kind of get exaggerated. I started questioning the validity of everything I saw on the internet when I started seeing tweets by Abraham Lincoln. I thought, I'm not sure about this. This might not be accurate. Regardless, if this is C.S. Lewis or someone else, I think there's a lot of thought that we can give to this very concept. Because we know, even with a fulfilled life, even with a life that we may look at ourselves and say, I have the family that I like, I have friends, I have a church family, I'm confident in my salvation, I have a Savior, I have all of these things, and there is a sense in which it's a fulfilled life, and yet at the same time, there are times in which things are lacking. Almost like that picture in Hebrews where they felt like strangers in this world. It's almost like we were designed and created for something slightly different than what this world can possibly provide. And so we come back to the question, how are the dead raised? Before we read 1 Corinthians 15, if you'll go ahead and turn to the next slide, there's a passage from 1 John that I want us to think about, because I think he actually answers the question probably as good as any place within the New Testament. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2, he says, "Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." Now, I want you to think for a moment about who's writing this. And my best understanding is that we're dealing with John the Apostle. So I'm going to go with that assumption here. And if that's true, then we have an individual who's writing this who essentially says, it hasn't come yet. What we shall be has not yet appeared. In the midst of a book, by the way, that he continually shows this has appeared, this has appeared, this has appeared, and yet suddenly we get to this part, this has not yet appeared. John walked with Jesus. John was there in the transfiguration. John saw the resurrected Jesus. And yet he still seems unsure about what that might look like when all is said and done. I say that because I think the best biblical answer to the question of how are the dead raised in the second part, which is with what body will they have essentially, the answer is simply, I don't know. And neither do you. Because what John and Paul can give us are just glimpses. And we can learn some things from that, but we just don't have that perfect picture about what that might look like. And we'll kind of elaborate on just a little bit of that through 1 Corinthians 15. And I want to go ahead and read this section. I know it's lengthy, but when we're dealing with a topic such as this, a topic that can lead us into different directions, that we can be influenced by lots of different places, I think it's important to stay within the text, to allow the text to really speak to us first and foremost. And so I want to start reading in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 35 and make our way through this, and we're going to look at the overall picture of what Paul is trying to convey to the Corinthians. So in verse 35, Paul writes, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. Within this text, Paul sets it up with two questions. First of all, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Now, we need to put a little bit of context to this as well, because we have to ask ourselves, in this text, why is Paul actually asking these questions? It would be one thing to ask this question in a very serious manner and then say, okay, I'm going to ask it for you, and I'm just going to go ahead and answer it. But there's a little bit more to it in this. If you remember from the lesson yesterday and earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, he's already kind of established this writing routine of someone will say, okay? And he's not using that in a very high manner for what they're saying. And I think this question is very similar to that. There are some who may be asking, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? But his answer to that, or his response to that, tells us how he thinks of the question. He says, you foolish person. So I don't know exactly what's all behind this question. Maybe there was just the idea that some were almost asking in a, humiliating kind of way where it's like, you say that the dead are going to be raised? Yeah, what does that look like? What does that body look like? Maybe they recognize what we understand to be truth as well. What happens to us when we die? We know the biblical answer. And we've and we've seen it in real life as well. It's dust. We know that given enough time, these bodies that are so precious to us while we walk this earth, and our loved ones who are so precious to us while we walk this earth, will return to dust. And maybe there's part of that, like, how are you going to do anything with that? How is this dust going to be raised up? I don't know exactly what was behind the question, but Paul seems to think there's something else there, and so he wants to get their attention, and he says, you foolish people. And then he proceeds to provide an answer to the question regardless. And the overall picture is what I want us to look at. And first of all, death precedes life. That's the pattern. And it's backwards. What we know of now is the opposite. We live, we die. But Paul says here, it changes. It changes. We die, and only then do we live. It's a beautiful picture. And he's using this imagery of a seed, that what comes to life cannot come to life until after it is sown. Again, symbolizing our death and our burial. And so the first thing Paul wants us to know is, yes, there is going to be a death. Yes, there is that dust concept. But it is through that very death that God then produces life. And then the second part of that, which is probably the question that we ask ourselves more and are probably more interested in, and Paul is going to spend quite a bit of time on it here, is really the idea, simply in this text, that God does provide a body, but that body will be changed. And so we come back to what does that look like? And again, I don't know. If anyone was in a position like John, Paul could have elaborated a little bit more, and yet what is he trying to teach us? He's trying to teach us, yes, there is a spiritual body, but it will be changed. If anything, from this entire text that we should take away from it, it is this very fact: that body will be changed. It's a little bit like the illustration that he's using here. If I just held up an acorn and I asked you without any other knowledge, all right, you don't know about oak trees, and I just said, if I bury this acorn, can you tell me based on this acorn what it will look like in the final product? There's nothing there that indicates what it will look like in the end. And so we naturally ask the question, and we think about things like, certainly there's some continuity between our current bodies. There has to be, right? This is the essence of what we know. In so many ways, this is who we are. There has to be some continuity between the current body and that which is changed. And again, we have to look at it and say, I don't know what that is. And if we're not careful, we can go down a path that can start to get probably further beyond the text than we want to go. Because if we just think about our bodies right now, and we know there's going to be a spiritual body, well, it's easy to kind of just take the image of what we see in ourselves and think that's what it's going to be, just in a different form, right? Well, let's think that through. I'm in my mid-40s, or getting closer to my mid-40s now. My hair's a little thinner. It's a whole lot grayer. Am I going to be raised in my 42-year image body? Maybe I'll be raised in my 20-year-old image body. If I live to be 80, will I be raised in my 80-year-old image body? Or what about this? I have two sisters who unfortunately were not able to live beyond 1 week in their life. What's the continuity with their resurrection? You see where it can lead? So much of how we think is wrapped up only in what we know here and now. And in a lot of ways, it reveals to us kind of our priorities and our theology, even in this world. But what is Paul trying to get them to think? Yes, just as God raised the initial body from death, so there will be a spiritual body, but it will be changed. And I don't know what that change might be any more than I can tell what an oak tree would be just from an acorn. If you go to the next slide, we get a little bit of an indication. We get a comparison here, if you will, and I love this, and I hope you remember this, because when you just look at these ideas, the body is sown in this way. It is sown perishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is sown in weakness. It is sown natural. It is the man of dust. That is the reality that we have right now. But what does Paul want them to take away from this? Here's what the resurrected body is like. It is raised imperishable. It is raised in glory. It is raised in power. It is raised a spiritual body, and that's probably where we struggle with a little bit, but it will resemble the man of heaven. Now that's a good picture. Even at 42, I have pains that I didn't have a few years ago. And I know some of you have more than I do. And I love to think about that time and whatever image that body might have. I don't have to deal with that. And I hope you're filled with hope at that possibility. But what's most important in this imagery, just as we bore the image of the man of dust, do you see the other side of that? We will bear the image of the man of heaven. Beyond comprehension. I don't know what that will be like, but just the thought that when John and Paul tried to describe this body, where they came down to was, we will be like him. Friends, that's amazing. And that is what we have to look forward to. I want us to think about some practical lessons that we can take from that, because again, when you look at this overall picture of what's happening in 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul asks these questions based on the reality that, yes, since Christ was raised, you will be raised as well. And he says, then what about our resurrection? We have to die first. But God will give us a body. And it will be different, it will be changed, and it will be like Christ himself. That's the essence of this text. So what kind of practical lessons can we take away from this? And if you want to just go ahead and move through about 4 slides and go to the end of it, you can see them all up there. First of all, sometimes we worry about the wrong things. And I think in this idea, it kind of shows that reality. We can get so twisted up and we can get so drowned into kind of the details of, well, what does the body look like exactly, that we miss the most important thing. And the most important thing is there will be a resurrection. We can trust God to take care of the details. But there will be a resurrection. As we said earlier, you will be changed. So will the people you know. So will your loved ones. And I think we can see another important lesson. This body will be perfectly suited for eternity. The sun is perfectly suited for our time here on earth. The stars are perfectly suited for their purpose here on earth. The heavenly body will be perfectly suited for whatever that realm might look like next. And I actually want to work backwards from this just a little bit, because if in fact God has designed all of those other things perfect for their reality, for their purpose, then can't we say that he's done the exact same thing with our bodies now? Think about that for a moment. Our bodies are perfectly designed for their purpose here and now. We may not like that necessarily as we go through those pains and as we know we lose our loved ones. We may not like the temporary side of things that we live through right now. But just go with me for just a moment and maybe appreciate what God has done more than ever before when we see how our bodies currently are perfectly suited for what we have to do right now. He's given us a mind that allows us to comprehend his world and his nature. He's given us a heart that has the ability to feel empathy for people, to love in such a way that leads us to change who we are and serve others, to put others above ourselves. He's given us what we need to proclaim the gospel. He's given us what we need to look like the image of Christ. And just maybe there are some lessons along the way that we need to learn from the temporary side of things. That doesn't ever mean that it doesn't hurt when we lose someone. It's never going to mean that. But what if being hurt myself teaches me how to forgive? What if my mistakes teach me how to be humble? And what if coming to Christ myself gives me the rationale for why I need to be that more adamant about teaching someone else about Christ? Our bodies are suited perfectly for what we have right now. But I also want us to see the end image, which is Christ. If we know ahead of time, if we know that you and I and all of us will one day, in some sense, bear the image of Christ, boy, shouldn't that help us think about how we live our life now? We're going to, in some sense, look like him. I think we need to look like him now as well. I think we can practice for that eternity. We will bear the image of Christ. We bear the image of Christ now in a unique way as well. So finally, I want to tie this back to unity for just a moment, as that is the whole picture of what we are looking at. I don't think it's a coincidence that in a book of 1 Corinthians that deals with division at the very onset, and we see that division creeping through so many different aspects of church life, I don't think it's an accident that here we get to kind of the culmination of that in 1 Corinthians 15, where we find such a powerful case for unity. It's in the resurrection. You say, how? One of the things that has been one of my greatest struggles in ministry, in every place I've been, I imagine it's that way for others as well, is that we have to kind of overcome and deal with these different demographics, these divisions within us. And some of them are so innocent on the surface, and they're not necessarily wrong, and yet underlying everything, there's just this constant division among us. Right now, we're working on a small group ministry, and one of the most difficult challenges that I'm facing in putting this together is the reality that people don't like to come out of those demographics. We like that comfortable feeling of being with those who are like us. Do you realize what the resurrection body does? It takes down all of those things that so commonly divide us right now in a beautiful way. My fear is that maybe we've gotten to be a little bit too comfortable with having those divisions. And you hear it as well as I do. When we connect people to churches, you hear things like, we need to find somebody who has something in common for this person, right? Isn't that Christ? Shouldn't that be Christ? I know I'm relatively new to getting back to the Southeast region, but is football really more powerful than Christ for connecting? Should it be? You've seen it. You've lived it. What if we can realize that the end goal is that God will break down all of those superficial things that so easily divides us right now? And if we realize that all of those will be gone one day, what if as a congregation we can really think seriously about, let's put them down right now. Let's realize that the core that brings us together is Christ. I know hobbies are fun, and I know what it's like to be with people our own age. But God put us all together in a united family. And as I said at the beginning, we have a foundation unlike anything else to bring us together. The question is, are we brave enough to try to live it within our congregations? It's not an accident that Paul ends with the resurrection in a book that's so filled with division. Because one day, once we have that reality and are raised up, all those barriers will be broken down. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are as well. God bless.